Hello and welcome back to the James Kennedy podcast, baby. We're still here, we're still doing it, man. Can you believe it? And it just gets better and better because today, you're in for a treat. Now, before I get started, let me ask you a question. Have you subscribed to the damn podcast yet? Don't lie to me. Have you hit the like button? Have you smashed the notification bell and smashed all the other things one must smash in this day and age? If you haven't, get on it. But let's get down to business. Check this out. Metallica, Green Day, Smashing Pumpkins, Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, Frank Turner, the Wildhearts, you name them, you pick a band. Today's guest has probably interviewed them, flown with them, hung out with them, and partied with them. A long-time writer for Kerrang Magazine, as well as NME, Rolling Stone, and The Telegraph, today's guest is also the author of several books, including the most recent one, the absolutely jaw-droppingly brilliant Bodies, Life and Death in Music. This guy has seen it all. He's been to the parties, he's been on the tour bus, he's been on the private planes, he's seen the highs, he's seen the lows, and he's only just lived to tell the tale. I'm really excited to chat with today's guest, so without further ado, it is my honor to welcome to the podcast the legendary music journalist, Mr. Ian Winwood. Ian, how are you, sir?
Hello, James, and hello to all your listeners. Greetings from a warm but slightly overcast Camden Town in fashionable North London. It's lovely to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you, man. I must say you're looking very fresh and dapper as well. Is this the new healthy you we're looking at today?
It is actually, yeah. I mean, I've swapped. Some addictions are better than others, James, and I've swapped waywardness, shall we say, for an addiction to exercise, which I've actually had for a little while. Which is good, actually, because I have a propensity to balloon. My wife, Ruth, says that she's never known a male of the species to just kind of explode in getting excess weight at even the mildest indulgence. So, right. So I'm sort of like every day. This makes me sound tragic. I'm going on Friday, as we speak. On Friday, I'm going to do an event at the I Write Literary Festival in Glasgow, and I've got to fly first thing in the morning. And the reason I'm flying, by the way, is because the trains aren't working. I don't just want your listeners to think that I'm just
jet setting rock and roll douchebag.
all wrecking the planet single-handedly with short haul flights.
Yes,
and it's like, am I going to be able to exercise that day? And it's like, no, I'm not. This is not a good first impression, James. I'm very well. I will be exercising this evening. Before speaking to you this morning, I have cleaned my share of the flat. So I'm feeling virtuous.
This is amazing. Now, for those people who haven't read Bodies yet, or who don't know the personal story to yourself, which I didn't know. I mean, I knew of your work, of course, as a musician, but I had no idea that your own life story could be made into a fucking Hollywood movie. So for people listening, trust me, what you just heard Ian describing there, it could not be further from the way that you've spent the bulk of your life so far in terms of your lifestyle choices. But we'll get into all of that. What I wanted to start with is for those people listening who don't know who you are, you know, the three douchebags who've been living in a cave for the past 25 years. Who are you? What is it you do? And what have you done? And what's your general vibe? What's going on?
Well, I'm a music journalist, James. I guess now I'm an author and journalist. If I were to be appearing on a Sky Arts program as a talking head, beneath my name on the screen would be Ian Winwood, author and journalist. But I'm a music journalist. I write about music, and I've been doing that with the exception of a year at the end of the 90s in a bookshop, where I was gainfully employed as the worst bookseller who ever walked planet Earth. Recounted briefly, but I hope humorously in the book, I've earned my living writing about music and writing about people in bands. It's slightly strange talking about it because I've got to be careful if anybody is minded to think, well, this guy just clearly is the most fascinating person I've ever heard in my headphones. I've got to buy his book immediately and sprints to a bookshop or to an Amazon warehouse because they just can't bear to wait for the delivery. I don't want to duplicate too much what's in the book, but I'll very briefly say that when I was 14, I happened upon a magazine called Kerrang, and maybe it was certainly within that time frame. My mum said to me, "Have you thought about what you'd like to do for a living?" And I said, and I didn't say I wanted to be a music journalist. I said, yeah, I'd like to write for Kerrang, specifically that magazine. And then I heard the most important words of my young life, possibly the most important words of my life, which was, well, someone does those jobs. I don't see why it shouldn't be you. Rather than, don't be silly.
Get a real job. Yeah.
So I've spent, and that's, it was 30 years, January just gone that I got my first berth on a national magazine. And that's been my gig ever since. So that's who I am, James. I write about, I guess I appear most often at the moment in the Telegraph, which is brilliant and strange for me because the Telegraph's politics are not my own, to put it mildly. However, as a writing gig, it's just exceptional. So, and it's the first time in my writing career I've written for other, respectable publications, quote unquote, respectable publications, Q, Mojo, for example, and the NME. But it's always been I've always been sort of the rock guy, and I do love loud music. Don't get me wrong. That's, if I were to throw a giant fire, I'd be armfuls of, there would be Tom Waits and there would be particularly Elvis Costello. But the volume quotient of the CDs, I'd smuggle out of the flat with two cats, along with two cats. Would emphasize, volume. Maybe not necessarily metal, although metal, punkier metal.
Yeah, I got the gist in your book that you lean towards the punkier, alternative, underdoggy type of bands.
And energetic, loud music, I would say, is my default setting with melody and played loud, and I'm certainly not averse to speed either. Never trust a music journalist that doesn't have a wide variety of tastes. But if I had a neighborhood to which I returned, that's it.
And you've worked with, like, pretty much, if you could name a band, you've worked with them, whether it's reviewing a gig or interviewing them. I mean, I had no idea. I want to get right into the book, your most recent book, Bodies, in depth. But one of the things I had no idea of, as a long-standing musician myself, was the jet-setting lifestyle that a journalist at your sort of level was privy to. I mean, you'd be flown out, from the UK to California to interview Green Day and then flown back or something like that. So you've worked with the top of the top, basically, and lived that lifestyle as well. So I mean, anyone listening, whoever your favorite band is, it's likely that the guy you're listening to right now has actually met them and covered them at some point.
It was ridiculous. This doesn't happen anymore because of technology and the fact that, not for the record companies actually, and not for the streaming services, and those two things are increasingly intertwined. The musicians get a raw deal, as is widely reported. But sort of 20 years ago, I joined Kerrang 22 years ago. 22 years ago this September. And just the amount of, I go into this in the book, and it was difficult to write about all this stuff, to find a tone of voice that didn't make it sound like I was not just name dropping, but place dropping as well.
Nice.
But I wanted to give the reader an insight into what that life at that time, in terms of the access to the bands and the geographical access to the bands, was like. And I think, I hope at least I was able to do so. And I think I'm figuring this out literally talking to you now. And if I've been successful in doing that, the reason is because I never lost my sense of amazement that I was being sent to all these places, and Tokyo and Los Angeles and Seattle and New York and Cape Town, and a ridiculous array of world cities, without having to pay for it.
Yeah.
But not only without having to pay for it, being paid to do it. I just never lost my sense of wonder about that. And in fact, there's a story on the first, literally at the start of the book, of me going to Los Angeles with it would be unkind to name them, but with a record company press officer and a let's just say a very famous and seasoned rock photographer, older than me. And they'd been upgraded, and they were just so kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Just so kind of over it all and dispirited about it, and actually almost resentful, James. Wow. And I never got like that. I mean, and I would have found it outrageous had I done so, and I would have found it actually that kind of ungratefulness and cynicism actually about what I did. The idea that I would be sent to New Orleans or anywhere, actually, a lot of the places were not particularly, Grand Rapids, Michigan is not a particularly interesting place to go. Detroit is not, it's like being a character in Grand Theft Auto. But to go to these places that I would never have seen, or I just never lost my sense of wonder about that. So I wanted to sort of bring that to life for the reader, and I hope that kind of my sense of, I say in the book, those were wonderful times.
Yeah.
It would. I remember once I went to LA in 3 times in 4 weekends, and one. At the end of one of those trips, I was doing the second trip was the Foo Fighters, and I remember getting back and landing at Terminal 4 at Heathrow, which was then British Airways transatlantic hub, picking up my bag from Terminal 4, going to Terminal 2, getting on a plane to Stockholm, and then driving up to Fagersta and spending a couple of for 2 nights, spending an entire day with the Hives, who were still a great band, or a very good band, but then were one of the hottest bands certainly in Britain, and being driven around with the Hives in their van so we could take photos. Me and my friend Paul Harris, photographer, who's features in the book, and the Hives bought us bars of chocolate, which I just thought was unbelievably sweet. And then in the evening we went 10-pin bowling with the Hives. And then on the Thursday, I flew back to London. I had a birthday party on the Friday night, stayed up, to a ridiculous hour, and then went back to Los Angeles, and which is crazy. But I mean, I hope as I'm recounting this, I still just thought, well, this is just what a privilege it is to...
Oh, it's insane. I mean, what a moment in time as well that you lived through. I mean, you experienced firsthand and you lived through it and indulged in it, the kind of classic sex, drugs and rock and roll era that the music industry is famous for. And I know all that's changed so significantly now, but in reading the book, I could tell it really oozes through the pages that, I mean, still to this day, you've not lost that kind of innocent sense of wonder and awe, that kind of working class. I mean, you're a Barnsley boy, right?
That's right.
Yes. So
coal mining stuff, like the boys from the valley.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that for that reason, I really related to the voice that the book is written in, because, it had that kind of working class sense of being at the master's table, and almost still being surprised and amazed that you're in the fucking party, in the building, you know what I mean? But I think it's important to point out at this early stage in the conversation that the book is not, your typical rock and roll tell-all. I was hanging out with fucking Name Drop 1 when Name Drop 2 walked in, and, it's not like that at all. I mean, when you said about your place setting rather than name dropping, that I think that was perfectly perfectly put, because that is, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of big names in there, and there are a lot of like salacious rock and roll stories in there that'll blow your fucking mind. But that's not really what the purpose of this book is. And when I released my book, Noise Damage, I had to battle with a lot of the assumptions that people make when you write a rock and roll memoir, because everybody assumes that that's all it's going to be, is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And my story was definitely not that. It was the exact opposite of that. And your book, Bodies, is definitely not that. I mean, it's dark, I mean, what you're doing is very brave in the book and very important, I think, to open up the conversation about the true reality of how most musicians spend their lives. The book is hilarious and it's mind-blowing, and it is sex, drugs, and rock and roll as well. But I don't really think that that's the purpose of the book. I thought it was very broad, and I thought it was very important that you were being so brutally honest about how the industry actually affects, shall we say, the mental health of its most important asset, which is its artists. Was that the purpose of this book, or is that just what came out because it's the true reality of the world as you were experiencing it?
Yeah, I hoped to. The book is kind of two books in one. It's kind of it has that aspect of it, which is about half of the book, and it has me. I guess because I thought that the stories about myself were interesting, and also to show that I had skin in the game. Before sort of explaining that, it was important to me, James, that I wrote a book that rocked, really.
Oh yeah.
That had a bit of swing about it, that when appropriate, had energy about it, and when appropriate, if I could say something humorous or darkly comic, I would do so. So I think it's a slightly fleeter book. It's slightly fleeter of book than perhaps it sounds if explained. Now, you used the word mental health, and I don't know why. There's something that in me that recoils a little bit when I hear that.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I'm the author of the book. That doesn't mean that I am right to recoil in that sense, but it's definitely part of the landscape. When I was recruiting people to speak to me about speak to me for the book, it took me a long time to try and explain to them what it was that I thought I was writing about. And as time progressed, I tightened it up. And it was, I'm writing a book about how the music industry makes people ill. Will you speak to me? When it was in the stage, the book was at the stage where it had been copy edited and it was about to be proofread. On a publisher like Faber, there's a lot of work that goes in after you think you've finished. If I knew then what I know now, I would have a nervous breakdown right here on the spot. So it was intense. Faber's process makes books better, and it certainly made my books better. Your listeners might hear that I have a cat meowing at the door. Do you mind if I just?
I'm glad to know that was a cat and not the hostage you've got gagged and bound to the.
Yeah, well, not hostage, right? I knew you were going to do that. So yeah, and so if you get for any would-be writers out there, or writers indeed, who get a book deal with Faber and Faber, brace yourselves, okay? Because it's intense, but they will make your book better. But by the time it was nearing completion, and the various hooks. So there's an editor, copy edit, a proofread. My wife, who works in publishing, proofread it as well. So there were various hurdles. It was like running a race. It was like running a marathon on a track and thinking you'd reach the end, and then discovering you've got to actually run another half marathon.
How long did it take? Just out of interest, how long was the whole process?
16 months from farm to table.
Got you, right.
I thought it would take me 4 months to write it, which is so cute. I'm so cute. But as by the time the reason I mention all this, James, apart from to let your listeners know just how very much I suffered for my art, by the time it was nearing the completion, gigs were starting up again. and I was going out, and one of the things that really surprised me was just how much of my social life was seeing people at concerts that, I hadn't arranged to see, that I knew. And it's like, oh, hi, so-and-so, how you doing? And that was starting to happen again. And and people, you say, oh, what have you been doing? How did you pass your time? And I said, oh, I've been writing a book. And this is, to press officers, record company people in bands. And they said, oh, how have you been passing your time? I said, I've been writing a book. Oh, what's it about? I've been writing a book about how the music industry makes people ill. My lips to God's ears, James, that to a man and woman, everyone went, oh, right, yeah. No one went, oh, what do you mean?
Right.
What do you mean? How does it do that? Everybody went, yeah, right. Since it has been published, before it was published, gosh, I'm better at not sounding like name dropping in the book than I am here.
Go for it. Drop away.
But I interviewed Yard Act, for some of your listeners may know, for The Telegraph, and I sent their singer a book. Just because I liked him and I got on with him. And, you sort of always hope that perhaps they might, give you a little shout out. I certainly didn't ask for it, and I didn't, advocate for it. And he posted a thread just saying, I implore people to read this. I got a message yesterday, a private message from a group, a number of the people interviewed in it, practicing musicians. And the reason that I'm telling you and your listeners this, James, primarily so that everyone knows that I'm great, but also that the musicians themselves so far reckon that I've portrayed their world correctly.
Right, that's important. Yeah.
And if you'd like me to explain what that world is and the disjoint between the public-facing role and what actually goes on.
I would love that. I think it's so important. It's so important. And it's beautifully described in the book as well. I should point out at this point that the book is also fucking hilarious. And it is a rock and roll roller coaster. It's got all the shit you'd expect in a rock and roll book. And it is a kind of a personal journey of your own life as well, which I must point out has been fucking mental. And you could have had a movie made about your life. This book, it's got all the salacious rock and roll stuff in there that you want. All the behind the scenes, world of your favorite bands and the whole lifestyle that comes with that. I'd love to have your description now, before I interrupted you, but I wanted to just sort of interject before people think, oh, fuck me, that sounds heavy going. The book is hilarious. It's a rip-roaring ride. I read it in 2 days, which I've never done for any book in my life ever. So I would implore everybody to go out and get it, because it will dominate your weekend. You'll be able to put it down.
Well, that's high praise indeed. Thank you very much. That's really a lovely thing to say, James, and a lovely thing to hear. When I started writing the book, I'm not sure I quite understood what I was doing when I started it. Let's clear that. And I went up to see the singer-songwriter Frank Turner. Some of your listeners may know, who is one of my rare exceptions that as someone who I write about, with whom I have become friends. And there is a story about Joe Walsh from the Eagles, right? In the 1970s, this didn't make the book, so this isn't a spoiler. But I wanted to discuss this with Frank as my starting point. This is before I'd written Word One. So I went up to his house in furthest North London, 2 buses. He's since moved, and I don't know why that's relevant that he's since moved, but anyway. And we sat at his table, and I told him the story of Joe Walsh, which was in the 1970s. Joe Walsh, the guitarist with the Eagles, the wildest member of the Eagles, woke up, not on tour, woke up in a hotel room in Paris, in bed, clothes laid out, everything present and correct, save for one detail, which is that he could not remember going to Paris. He had no idea how he got there from his home in Los Angeles. Now, the listeners won't see this, but James quietly laughed, but laughed when he heard that story. Frank did too, and I did as well. Now, why is that story funny? Because it's not really, is it? It's a sign of a man. It's deeply, if you wake up on a different continent and you don't know how you got there.
True.
You have made some foolish choices in your life. So that was one of it, one of the aspects. Why do we celebrate that when it is deeply the behavior of someone who clearly is not well? For the record, Joe Walsh used that as the impetus from which to repair his life. So there was that aspect of it, but there was also the idea that actually there were a few ideas, but as the book progressed, it was the idea that musicians. I explore in that aspect of the book, in the more journalistic aspect of the book, I suppose. I explore why musicians lack a vocabulary with which to complain about things that are legitimate grievances. And it is because as a public-facing role, if we go and see the Stones or Green Day or any group, really, even bands whose music is, a little bit downbeat, say, we want a positive experience, and the musicians project a positive experience. So they leave aside what is going on in their private lives. I guess as they should, because you don't want to go and see Biffy Clryo and Simon Neal say, I'm depressed at the moment. I've had a terrible time.
It's all a bit shit, yeah.
Yeah, he is the captain, and plays the captain, and then people go, what was that about? Yeah. So I do get that. Music journalism at its worst is PR rather than journalism that assumes that the bands themselves are always as excited and should be as excited, and that there's no reason, it's not even considered that they might have problems. Now, music journalists do write about problems, but you will notice that it is often in the past tense. So a band releases an album and talks about how on the last tour or the recording of the last album, they were at each other's throats, they were falling apart, there were addiction issues, whatever it might be, often those. But now it's fine. And you look back over their interviews and every previous album they were talking about, it was falling apart, but now it's fine. And we always assume that it's fine. So we're part of the sales campaign, if you like, in that way. I'll give you a concrete example. I won't name the publication because I don't want to get fired. But on the morning that Taylor Hawkins from the Foo Fighters passed away, I was asked to write a long piece about his death. And I said, this was, a couple of weeks before the book came out, maybe 3 weeks before the book came out. And I said, I will do that, but I want to make clear that 50-year-olds or 51-year-olds, I think he might have been, dropping dead in hotel rooms, that's not normal. It's not normal. And some of your listeners may remember that Taylor Hawkins almost very nearly died in exactly the same circumstances in 2001 at the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington in August after the group played Leeds and Reading, as I call it, rather than Reading and Leeds. And I didn't want to say, oh my gosh, she's died of a drugs overdose, although that information had come to light before the piece needed to be filed, that, the signs didn't look good. Now, to give the publication credit, they have said to me that when the what's the phrase I'm looking for? When the official cause of death is released, I will be able to write a feature that explains that. But at the time, they just wanted a celebration of his life. And of course, there is much to be celebrated in that life, but that life has come to an end. And I found it telling that from the very off, it was like, no, we don't want that. We want this. We don't want, I wouldn't suggest only that. Look at the music, this man made, millions of people happy with their music. And I'm not here to dismiss or discount that in any way. But people people should not be dropping dead in hotel rooms in murky circumstances. And I would go so far as to suggest, James, that it is an abdication of responsibility to overlook that. And the press tends to do that. So that's, from my part of the game, that's one of the things that I explore. It is viewed, being in a band is viewed as being a dream job. And because it's a dream job, its participants are expected to be grateful all the time. They're expected to be grateful for what they receive from their record companies. They're expected to be grateful to be doing this. But there are enormous costs to this way of life. Being in a band involves, being away from home for vast periods of time in a weird environment. There are just so many sacrifices that they're required to make. And even saying this out loud, I'm aware that I'm not quite explaining it properly, because even I saying it are thinking, well, gosh, they're on tour. How hard is it? But I go into this in the book and explain why this idea that they don't, why this notion that what they're doing is because other people would desire to do it without ever having done it. So not knowing the terrain in its full 360 scope. They just see the public facing bit and think, oh my gosh, isn't that amazing? They read the press and think, isn't that an incredible thing to be doing? That musicians sort of don't have the vocabulary to explain what it is that is killing them in some instances. They have a phrase, and James, if I've heard this once, I've honestly heard it 500 times. And they say, and maybe you said this as a musician, you say this as a musician, oh, I don't want to complain. Friends of mine have proper jobs. They keep saying, I don't have a proper job. Yeah. They do have a proper job. What they don't have is a normal job, insofar as there is such a thing. But they don't sleep in their own beds. It's not a normal job. And I do wonder, I say this in the book, I do wonder, James, if things could be improved by just changing that description. Yeah. It is a proper job, because if it's not proper, it's improper. And if it's improper, it's invalid. And if it's invalid, it makes the people doing it negotiate from a position of weakness.
And I think if we started changing the narrative within our community and society more broadly about it being a proper job, I think that would then bring into question a lot of the financial malpractice within the industry, because a proper job's supposed to pay you a fucking living wage, whereas most musicians live on pot noodles, and can't pay their rent. And we're talking about bands that are in the charts that you've heard of, it's that's more common within the industry than the people that are actually making a good living. It's kind of like the 1% are making loads of money and everyone else is making fucking nothing at all,
Yeah. Even in the 1980s, Clive James, the great Clive James, wrote a review of Bob Geldof's autobiography, Is This It? Excuse me, published after the success of Live Aid. And Clive James wrote that when it comes to money, pop musicians, there's only two kinds of money that a pop musician can make. Less than you might think and more than you could imagine. And so that was already in place. Music has long attracted outlier personalities. We know this. We know the story, the Joe Walsh story, the Sid Vicious, the Keith Richards, Keith Moon, Mama Cass, Janis Joplin, Hendrix, so many. We know all that. But at least back then they were being paid a fair wage for a fair day's work. Now we have kind of a business model that's rigged to the point of scandal.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's dangerous waters, and there's no sort of training for this either. There's no training for significant success that arrives very quickly, and also for failure that arrives just as quickly as well.
Yeah.
where suddenly you're wanted and to be talked to, but everyone wants to speak with you. And then in the space of a single album cycle, in some cases, I think of Las Vegas would be an example of that. No one then wants to speak with you. And you think, for a time, I got to do the thing that I most wanted to do with my life. And crowds cheer you, and you think, oh my God, I'm in the game. And then 2 years later, it's gone. And in my experience, young musicians, and they are young at that point in their career, often never quite get over it. It's just a weird world. If you read the book, I explain it so much better than that, Jim. and I go into it all. What I've tried to do in the book is never to lose the sense of wonder about the music itself.
Yeah. No, it all makes perfect sense. I mean, to me, it makes sense listening to you speaking, describing it right now, sort of off the cuff. But obviously, I have experience of being close to that world with my own story, you know. Yeah. So I kind of get it already. But in the book, there's a chronology to it, and your personal journey that weaves through that as well. Your personal growth and failure, and you know, catastrophe and trauma and things that happen through that journey as well. And it's so broad, you touch on so many different areas of this, whether it's the business model and the way that that's set up, or whether it's just the general culture where ill health is kind of celebrated and encouraged almost, you know. There's so much structural stuff to why this occurs. But what I found fascinating was that you draw on some studies as well, where you say that suicide rates amongst musicians are actually twice as high as the general population. That's fucked up. It's not right that people, that a whole community or an industry of people should have those stats. And it's also not right that people shouldn't be paid fairly. It's not right that mental ill health should be so prevalent within one industry. And it's not right that those people within that community shouldn't be allowed to talk openly and honestly about that, because of this mythology they've got to maintain, which is we're living the dream and it's all awesome, and we can't dispel that myth, you know?
Yeah. You're totally right. That an example of this that stuck in my mind. I mean, being the egomaniac that I am now, the book, for what it's worth, the book is as good as I know how to write. Now, it's lovely that you've said such nice things about it, James, and other people have said lovely things about it. But whether objectively it is a good book or not is really none of my business, because I have no control over that. Subjectively, in terms of what I am capable of achieving as a writer, I honestly can't do any better than that. So consequently, that being said, when I got the final finished version of it, I just read it again and again and again like a crazy person.
Right.
My wife told me I was a crazy person, and I had to narrate the audio book as well.
Oh, that's a killer.
If anybody likes the sound of my slightly top-end, vaguely northern accented voice, you can hear me reading the audio version. And let me tell you, there is nowhere to hide from a book when you have to read it precisely and with great care over the course of 4 days in an otherwise perfectly silent recording studio. There's nowhere to hide. So I'm glad I put the work in for that reason alone, because that would have been a truly miserable experience. But I'm noticing things that perhaps I did, or things that are leaping out at me with particular clarity that perhaps I hadn't noticed when I was putting the book together. And in the book's there's quite a few startling chapters in the book, but there's a chapter about musicians who actually have died. And very graciously, Grant Hurchison, who was the drummer in Frightened Rabbit, and the brother of Scott Hurchison, the band's singer, who ended his own life, died by suicide a few years ago. I was incredibly, and that's sort of one of the things about the book as well. I was entrusted stories that were precious cargo by people. My own aspect of the book, my own appearances in the book, those were my stories. I could do with those as I pleased. But other people entrusted me with really the worst things that had happened in their lives. And I had a duty of care to those stories. Grant Hurchison was one of those. His own brother committed suicide when they were in a band together. And he told me a story of them being on the road in the United States and being invited to play on Late Night with David The Late Show with David Letterman. And Scott didn't want to do it, but the band convinced themselves. They were bushed, they were beat. They'd done 2 consecutive US tours, one supporting the National, one headlining. They were beat, but it was the case of, well, all we've got to do is play on TV. Who wouldn't want to do that? Our friends at home have proper jobs. And Grant told me that if they had called the record company, and this is not a particular slight on this one record company, this is a universal truth. If they had called the record company and said, look, we need to go home, or at any point in the tour said, we need to go home, the record company wouldn't have taken them at their word. It would have been, well, let's get on a conference call with the manager, let's see how we can sort this. And by sort this is let's see how we can carry on. Rather than, well, you're the guys in the field, or the guys, or the women, the men or the women in the field, whatever it may be. You're the people in the field. You know best. We will take your word for this. We will give you the time to repair. If you need help with substance abuse, because that's what people do on the road, whether it's alcohol or drugs. We fund a rehabilitation clinic. We go there. Don't worry. Fix yourself up. It's always a case of the show must go on.
Yeah.
The show must go on. And I make the point in the book that this is the one taboo that is yet to be challenged. And I understand that it's difficult to be challenged, James, because if a band is playing a show tonight at, let's say, so I'm not being London centric, let's say the Sheffield Arena, for example, and its members are frazzled and deeply unwell, you still have the consideration that 12,000 people have bought tickets and may be coming down from. You might be coming from Leicester.
Yeah.
You might have sort of been. So it's there are serious considerations in place if you are going to pull a show. But the essential tenet that the show must go on is yet to be challenged. And I think in the case of Frightened Rabbit, which was obviously the starkest outcome and most tragic outcome possible, that was one of the factors that Grant brought up as being a factor in what happened. That treadmill work environment that no one dare speak the name of. We need to stop. We need to postpone. We need to cancel. We need to draw a line over this and draw breath and just recharge our batteries in a setting where we're not waking up in a different city every day.
And I think that speaks to a certain background hum of general desperation that lives in the lives of musicians, because most of us will never get to the point where we have the opportunity to do that, which is hardship and anxiety constantly within itself anyway, because you got to struggle, you got to juggle day jobs, you deal with daily rejection and all that sort of shit. When you finally get that fleeting moment, you don't want it to go, you don't want to fuck it up. So even if you're already burnt out and frazzled and unwell by that point, there's that kind of thing of like, well, what if this goes? Is this going to slip through my fingers and now I'm back working in McDonald's again or something, Yeah,
and there's a story in the book about, again, treading lightly, because I don't want to spoil it for anybody that might want to read it, of Simon Neal from Biffy Clryo, who spoke with me and whose input just totally brought alive the musician's experience from me. And I used Biffy Clryo as my template because of all the, hundreds, if not 1,000 bands that I've interviewed. They are the one that, to me, seem to have their shit together tighter than anyone that I have. They're a 3-person band. The rhythm section are twins, and Simon Neal has known them both since he was 7 years old. That's pretty solid foundation with which to start a group. But even they ran aground. For Ben, the drummer, it was alcoholism. But for Simon, it was just burnout. And he had, while about to embark on a short North American tour, that they did mostly complete. But the reason that he'd struggled on, I mean, it was an important American tour because it featured two notable concerts at which the band's US record company, Warner Brothers, would be watching at a festival in California called Coachella. And Simon had trained himself, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is his description, had trained himself to believe that the band's future and that everything depended on these two appearances at Coachella on consecutive weekends, and that if these concerts weren't honored, if they didn't appear at this festival, then the band would fall off a cliff and his life would fall off a cliff. That's not healthy.
No.
That's not a healthy way to be in.
No.
And he also said, while making the point that Warner Brothers have the different personnel in place now, we're going back sort of perhaps 9 years, and the band currently are on a US tour of decent sized US venues. So he did say that Biffy Clryo don't sell as many records, are not as popular in the United States as they are in other countries, and he can trace that right back to the day that he decided that he had to come home, because the paymasters at the record company took the view that, maybe even silently took the view that, well, obviously they don't really want
You're not interested. Yeah.
He played last weekend. Why can't he play this weekend?
Yeah,
Why is he going home? He obviously doesn't really want it. And then suddenly, the band's got a weird name. They were signed in the UK. They weren't signed by the American label. So the American label it's like, who are these from Scotland? And suddenly they're not a priority anymore. No one's got great enthusiasm behind them. And there was a tremendous amount of groupthink in the music industry, particularly at record labels. And, Simon flew home before the tour was finished, not very long before the tour was finished. He'd been urged to fly home by the management, and good for them, and by his family back in Scotland, and by Ben and James Johnson, the bass player, the drummer and bass player, respectively. So people within the organization had his back. But he feared that the record company would take a dim view of this. And he was right, it seems. And, the American arm of Warner Brothers just kind of didn't really get behind them as they should have done. Now, apologies for repeating myself. Those people, Simon was keen to stress, they've got a better team at the record company now who better understand the kind of issues that he was facing at the time. But back then, it was a case of, he's ungrateful, is what it boils down to. And again, that question of gratitude. He's ungrateful. We'll throw our money at something else. Actually, their money, because it comes out of their own.
Exactly. True. Yeah.
We'll throw their money at someone else. And it set them, no doubt about it, set them back in the US, set them back 10 years in the US.
And I think that exact example is why we all put up with so much shit, because it does happen. If it can happen to a band like Biffy Clryo at Coachella, it can happen to a much smaller band who's getting their one chance, and they've essentially given two fingers to the industry that's deemed them worthy over the gazillions of others that'll never get a chance.
Yeah, and they're thinking, this is our dream job. This is our dream job. It's got to be, everything about it's got to be perfect. Any complaint is illegitimate. Steering them in.
Well, I had Jackie from Girl School, another Yorkshire girl, on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying that she's the happiest she's ever been because she's doing meditation. She's been sober for 6 years, I think. She's a vegan, she does yoga, she does all these things, and now she just loves touring and just playing the shows. I mean, granted, they're at a level where they've kind of got their fan base, they're a legacy band, that sort of thing. They kind of ticket doing their thing. And she seemed to be someone that seemed to have it all together. She wasn't any longer that interested in the the rock and roll roller coaster, having toured with Lemmy, she'd seen it firsthand and stuff like that, and she'd seen so many talented friends come and go that she knows she's seen the dark side firsthand. But she said that now she's doing these other things, such as you mentioned earlier, exercise, eating well, sleep, avoiding the temptations. She's actually way happier than ever before. And I thought, okay, well, she's one of the few people I've spoken to that seems to have gotten it together in this industry. You mentioned Biffy Clryo there. Are there other bands that you know of that seem to have it together? And what seem to be the common traits that they have that may be, is a kind of a good model for smaller bands or other bands to follow?
Well, all of the people that have it together sort of that I'm about to mention operate at a higher sphere.
Right.
However, bands that have now got decades behind them, who are, road bands, touring bands, figure out a way to make that environment work for them. So Frank Turner, for example, and it could be something as simple as this. Frank Turner puts aside an hour a day in which to read a book, usually around dinner time, which is usually maybe about 6 o'clock. You don't want to, eat 10 minutes before you go on stage. He'll read a book, and the road crew, the tour manager, the rest of the band, his band, The Sleeping Souls, they know not to bother him. Whatever. They know not to bother him. It's his quiet time to read a book. That's preciously important to him. Muse, for example, this is slightly high end, but Muse's bass player, Chris Wolstenholme, told me that on off days, on days off, in Europe, he will come home and spend the night with his wife and his children in the southeast. Green Day, they have separate tour buses. You've got to slightly be at a level to have separate tour buses, but nonetheless, Metallica, they tour only in sort of 2 or 3 week bursts, and then even if they're in Europe, fly home. They do have their own private jet, which helps.
That helps, yeah.
and then fly home for a couple of weeks, to be with their families, to be away from the band. Actually, Yard Act are popular, but I hope he won't mind me saying this. It's not a great confidence, but James, the singer from Yard Act, told me that they too have that sort of 3-week touring burst and then a couple of weeks off. He has a young infant at home and a partner. It is about striking the balance between yourself as an individual, James, and your life and the lives of other people in your life as well, and your shared identity as a member of the band, and the people who survive and who prosper and who make it work learn to not only learn to understand and be able to keep their identity outside of the band intact as a human being, that's not related to, whether they are a jobbing musician who earns a modest living or, a bona fide rock star. Going home, being with the family, being away from it, that seems to be the key long term. But it takes conscious and deliberate thought and action, in my experience, from what I can see, to make that happen.
That's brilliant advice to hear, and I know that's going to be so useful because many of the listeners to this will be, fellow musicians and music fans and stuff like that. Yeah. So that's brilliant advice to hear. And I think that probably, there need to be structural changes within how the industry functions as well. And obviously, it's changed a lot now. It's even harder, I think, now. But I'm also a proponent of the new model over the old model as an independent musician to whom the old model the door was closed. After 10 years of trying and releasing 3 albums and touring Europe in a transit van, all that sort of stuff, the industry was still very much closed to us, despite radio play on Radio 1 and getting great magazine features and stuff like that. But inevitably, it was doing it myself, setting up my own label, my own music publishing company, that sort of thing, which gave me the ability to actually keep putting music out despite not having any, acceptance within the cool club as such, and also to make a living out of it. I mean, I haven't had a day job now in about 15 years, something like that, and make a modest living as an independent musician. So for me, I have a lot of good things to say about the new model of streaming and digital and social media, and the ability for bands to continue to put their art out and to continue to do something, even though you haven't got a record deal from a reputable company with a budget. So I don't think for me personally, I don't see it as all being bad, but it is very different, because now if you're doing it 100% independent like I do, there is no support structure at all. Whereas the problem with the old model was that there could have been a support structure, but the decision was chosen to not provide that.
Yeah.
But now bands don't even have any structure at all. We're just out there in the wilderness making it up for ourselves.
Well, that's fabulous, James. That and that you have figured out a way to make the new model work. The trouble with the overwhelming majority of not necessarily the overwhelming majority, because increasingly younger musicians are going the route that you are. For people signed to a record company, for bands signed to a record company, the fundamental problem here is they're not being paid properly. I perhaps should have said that at the very top of the show. They're not being paid properly. And because they're not being paid properly, I spoke in the book to a gentleman by the name of Tom Gray, a very strident campaigner who heads up an organization called Broken Record, which seeks to get fairer remuneration for artists. In the age of the pandemic, the record company and companies and streaming services were fine. It was the musicians and their crews that went broke. That is intellectually and morally indefensible. That just does not and should not make any kind of sense at all. I can think of no clearer example of the dysfunction and indefensibility of so much of the music industry than that simple fact. Pay them better. Pay them better. Pay musicians who have their songs streamed. Pay them better. Because the money is still in the industry. It's just not going to the artists anymore. And that is a grift. I am not victim blaming here. I'm certainly not, because I get why this happens. But the quicker musicians learn that they are being cheated, and learn that it is not just their right, but right itself to complain about this, because it's called the music industry. Without music, there is no industry. They are the content. They are the talent. And they should be getting paid. And I hope that going forward, that musicians are empowered to almost unionize, if you will, and say, hang on, 0.004 pence per stream through record company royalties. That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. There's a statistic in the book from Fergal Sharkey, the erstwhile singer of the Undertones, who said that you have to have something like 7,300,000 streams per month to make minimum wage. That needs fixing. And if that can be fixed, I think other things are more easily fixable from that point.
Amen. Man, that was a killer fucking riff, dude. You were on a roll right there. And thank you for saying it as well. No, you totally bang on, and I totally agree with you, man. Like, I do think that, like, a lot of the infrastructural stuff is now there for artists to support themselves and not be reliant upon, the exploitative machinery of old. Yeah. I mean, like, my new album, Make Anger Great Again, was recorded in this chair for free. It didn't cost me a fucking penny. I played all the instruments myself. I used free software. I didn't leave my fucking house, and that just wouldn't have been available to me, 20 or 30 years ago. And that's all great, and it's empowering and democratizing, and it levels the playing field. But if we still can't make any money at all then there's only so long we can continue to do this for.
That's right.
You know, before we've got to fucking hang the guitar back up on the wall and get a job.
Yeah, but I understand your point of view as well, James. You can get your music heard. That glass ceiling that separated you from an audience does not exist anymore. But people getting paid for their music is that's also gone as well, and it needs fixing. It needs fixing because it is not possible to make a living or it's virtually impossible. Let me put it no stronger than that. For a band, for example, Talk in the 1980s, decided to stop touring and became a studio band. That's not possible anymore. It's not to be a professional musician. It's just not possible for an emerging band or a band at a sort of Cardiff, St David's Hall. Almost got the wrong saint there. Cardiff, St David's Hall. Hammersmith Apollo, Sheffield City Hall level. To go, do you know what? We actually don't like being on the road. And we want to make music that we can't necessarily play live.
Yeah.
We're going to become a studio band. Not possible. So the music itself is suffering, actually.
So where does the solution to this lie then? I mean, so much of this now is at the influence of companies that aren't actually in the music industry, tech companies, for example. Where does the solution to this lie? Because I know that the problem is the mainstream major labels are in collusion with the tech companies to make sure that they're still getting the lion's share. So we're back to the same old usual fucking culprits again.
In writing the book, I didn't. That chapter of the book, that segment of the book, it's at the top of the 4th chapter where I speak to Tom Gray. I outline what the problems are, and I do it in a manner that I think is sort of entry-level business stuff in the way that I can understand. So I would not pretend to know the mechanics of fixing this, other than to say what I just said, James, which is the way to fix it. Like I said, music always attracts outlier personalities. However, the fact that they're now not being paid properly is a whole new. It's a whole new. So what it does is it attracts people who are hardwired for self-destruction or excessive behavior, or just wildly creative, independent free spirits. At the healthier end. But it also makes people who are steady as a rock musicians, the working conditions, it's making them ill as well. People who wouldn't ordinarily give craziness a go, crazy behavior a go.
Happened to me, yeah.
Right. Were they not working in that environment, they would not be unwell. They would not be burdened with the things that burden them in the music industry. So that's a sign that it's deeply flawed. It's both the chicken and the egg. It's the perfect. Right. I describe it in the book as the perfect monster. To help the people who are falling ill, who wouldn't fall ill were they not in the music industry, pay them properly. That I think will fix that. How you do that? I mean, you're up against corporate behemoths. So how to do that, I don't know. Keep talking about it. Musicians learning not to be afraid to talk about it, to say, I am not being paid properly. Please buy my record. That's all that I think that is within the musician's grasp at the moment, other than perhaps giant artists, speaking out. But the simple truth is, much of what I write about is simply the fact that, it's a music industry in the 21st century. They're not being paid properly, James. They're not being pay them properly. Simple.
Beautiful. Beautifully put. There's so much important stuff there. I mean, and I think that's the beautiful thing about the book, is that it does open up all of these questions, doesn't it? You touch on so many different areas of our beloved industry and the lives of our beloved, musicians and rock stars. It's such a broad book that I think does open up a lot of further discussion about the industry that we all know and love so well. So I'm going to plug it one more time, and I'll plug it, obviously, throughout the beginning and the end of the podcast as well.
Thank you.
The book is called Bodies, Life and Death in Music by Ian Winwood. I cannot recommend it enough. Like I said, I digested it in 2 days. I'm a veteran of the music industry, and there was stuff in there that just absolutely, my jaw was on the floor, honestly. Yeah. and much of it was music to my ears as well, because it resonated so much with my personal experience. I think it's a very important book. Beautifully written. It's funny. It's salacious and exciting. There's plenty of rock and roll gossip in there, but very important book as well. So I salute you for the much needed and important book that you brought to our shared community there, Ian. And before I let you go, because I have had you for way longer than I promised I would,
it's all good.
I just want to ask, how are you these days? Because your personal life story, like I said before, is one that could be made into a movie. I had no idea what you rock and roll journalists get up to. You've been through the ringer yourself. So are you better these days?
Yeah, I'm much better these days. They're very briefly, for anybody slightly confused by what that might be, my own personal story is in the book. The story of a death in the family that I hope is a rip-roaring tale. Actually, even when it happened,
it's mental.
It's crazy. I will be honest with you. Even when it happened, there was a little part of me thinking, this is a good story. You have got journalism in your bones, if that's what you're thinking. I won't say any more because I don't want to.
No. You've got to read the book. It's fucking mind-blowing. You will not believe it.
Even in that day. And that gave me the means and opportunity to sort of destroy my life. And the music industry itself didn't make me ill, because I don't really work in the music industry. I work adjacent to the music industry. No one's, sending me. I'm going to a literary festival in Glasgow on Friday. I'll be away for barely 24 hours. That's me being on tour. I don't say to my wife, right, that's me off to work, love. I'll see you in 4 months.
6 months, yeah.
But it gave me plenty of cover. And I think it's fair to say, I think it's actually utterly accurate to say that I placed my life in terrible danger. I don't know why I'm laughing about that. It's the Joe Walsh thing again. Oh, Ian almost killed himself. Isn't that great?
What a boy.
But yeah, I did this to myself, and then I with the help of others, but I just thought, this is getting silly now, isn't it? Do you really want to, die before you get old, to invert the great Who. I hope I die before I get old. It was like, I hope I get old before I die. So I decided to pull out of the nosedive, but I really did drive my needles into the red.
Nosedive would be an accurate term, I think.
Yeah, I do have my needles into the red, and those are the stories that belong to me. So those slightly zip along, and there's a measure of comic input from. I don't yuck it up, but yeah, it's like, look at this idiot. So that's it.
It was very beautifully handled. It was self-depreciating. It was funny. It wasn't maudling, or it wasn't a misery memoir. I can't speak highly of it enough. It's really well written. I mean, obviously we know you're a brilliant writer.
Shucks now.
But it's for me. Like I said, I'm still kind of processing it, because I rattled through it. I wanted to finish it before I spoke to you today, and I only got the book last week because it's only just come out. But I mean, I didn't have the option to put it down. Honestly, it wasn't like I was finishing it for a deadline. I just couldn't put the fucking thing down.
Right.
So I was glued. So yeah, I mean, it's dealt with humility and humor, but you're brutally open and honest in there as well. It's a very brave book, I think, and an important book that opens up, like I say, the sort of discussions that we've been touching on today. So once again, Bodies, Life and Death in Music by Ian Winwood. Go and buy it right now, and buy one for your friends, and tell everybody how good it is.
God bless you, James. Just in closing, and I hope this makes the cut. We've never spoken before. You messaged me. You've been lovely in your message. You just seemed, even via text, to be a really good guy. I've seen nothing today to dissuade me or disabuse me of that notion. Good luck with your own career. Good luck with your own writing. Good luck with the podcast. And it really, it honestly, has been a pleasure and a privilege to appear to board your vessel. for the last hour or so.
That's super kind of you, and the feeling is reciprocal and mutual as well, Ian. I feel like we could probably talk for hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. but I know you've got probably a gazillion of these to do, so I will let you go. But I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Honestly, it's been fascinating for me to be able to sort of speak to someone that's been right to the extreme ends of the industry that I spent so long trying to break the door down to. So I've really enjoyed it, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
Love to. It'd be my pleasure. You just let me know, James.
There we go, folks. You heard it here first. He's just committed to coming back every Wednesday. Ian, thank you so much for your time. I wish you nothing but the best with the book. It is incredible. I know it's going to be a busy few months for you, and you deserve all the success and accolades that you're getting for the book. If anybody wants to follow Ian's Twitter, it's at IanWinwood1 on Twitter, and the book is called Bodies, A Life and Death in Music. Ian, thanks so much for your time today. It's been absolutely brilliant fun talking to you. I wish you nothing but the best, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks again, man.
All right, bud. Stay safe. Lovely talking to you. Bye-bye, James. Bye.
See you, man. What a nice guy. Seriously, when you read the book and you realize what this dude has got up to in his life, the sheer level of fucking debauchery, I can't even tell you because I don't want to give it away. But what a seriously cool dude. I mean, not many people make it out the other side of that type of lifestyle. But seeing Ian there today, like all fresh faced and healthy looking and clearly, happy and healthy and in a much better place in his life now, gives a lot of hope that it is possible. As you're reading the book, that dude went to the depths. I had no idea, man. It blew my fucking mind. So you're never so far gone. You're never so low that you can't bounce back. And Ian is an example of it. And he made some great points there today, about the music industry and the true reality of how musicians really live and why that is. And I really hope that was informative and insightful for all you music fans out there. And I'm sure that any musicians listening will totally relate to a lot of that stuff as well. Do put your comments in about whether you agree or disagree or if you've your own experiences. The whole point of what Ian's doing with this book, I think, is to open up a broader conversation about this issue and to break the stigma that musicians feel about, this whole not having a proper job and, so therefore it's okay to basically live like a fucking homeless person on wheels. Yeah, I think it's great that somebody with Ian's kind of influence and reach and credibility within the industry is speaking out on these issues. It's a brilliant book. I'm going to plug it one last time. Bodies, Life and Death in Music. It's only been out like 2 or 3 weeks. It's super fucking fresh. There's tons of cool stories in there. It's really informative. It's really raw and brutally honest and funny as hell. I can't speak highly of it enough. Please go and buy a copy. Let us know what you think as well. And before I go, I'm going to nag you one more time. Subscribe to the fucking podcast, man. Come on, you're getting some good shit in this thing. All right, you go and get the book. I'll see you next week for another awesome episode of the James Kennedy Podcast. Take care of yourself. Take care of others. I love you loads. Bye-bye.